So in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at some of the causes of World War II. Now, when examining the causes of an event in history, it's important to see how they are connected to one another and what their significance is. Now, there are many causes of World War II, more than we'll look at in today's lesson. In fact, many historians would argue that World War II was a continuation of the First World War. But in this lesson today, we're going to look at four major causes of the Second World War, what they were and what impacts they had. And these are the four factors that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the rise of Hitler and other dictators. We're going to look at the policy of appeasement. We're going to look at the failure of the League of Nations. And we're going to look at the Treaty of Versailles. So to start off with here, we have the rise of Adolf Hitler and other dictators. Now, oftentimes in history, we can sort of fall back on this idea that a certain person or leader caused an event to happen. And often this is an oversimplification to say that a leader of a country is the one who caused a war to happen or caused the economy to go into recession or to recover. With Hitler, this is sort of one exception, though. Hitler was very influential. And without Hitler, there's a good case to be made that World War II doesn't happen. Now, how did Hitler rise to power? Now, he was a soldier in World War I. In fact, Hitler was not German. He was born in Austria, but he fought for Germany in World War I. He led an attempted coup in 1923, meaning he tried to overthrow the German government. This was an event known as the Beer Hall Putsch, which took place in Munich, Germany. Now, for his role in this planned coup, he ended up in prison. He was sentenced to a 5-year prison term, but he only served about 1 year before he was released. And while he was in prison, he wrote an influential book called Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. And in that book, he outlined his political philosophy, known as Nazism. Now, Hitler was an influential politician. He led the Nazi Party to win the most seats in the 1933 German election. He didn't win the majority of seats, but he won the most seats, a plurality of seats. And Hitler was made chancellor as the leader of a coalition government. However, Hitler quickly consolidated power and eliminated his political rivals, turning Germany into a dictatorship over the course of the first few months of his term. Now, you might be asking yourself, how did Hitler go from being a soldier to a prisoner for attempting to overthrow the government to the leader of Germany in just over a decade? Well, Hitler used a variety of tactics to gain control over the German people. Some of these included the fact that Hitler was a great speaker, with the power to get many people to support him. He was a very charismatic speaker. He would hold great rallies and speak to thousands of people who would come to listen to him talk. And he was a very convincing speaker. The moderate political parties would not work together in Germany, those near the center of the political spectrum, although they had more support than the Nazis at the time. So they wouldn't work together, which gave the people at the extremes, so people like Hitler on the far right of the political spectrum, as well as those at the far left of the political spectrum, the communists. The Depression of 1929 created lots of poverty and unemployment in Germany, which made people angry with the Weimar government, the government of the time of Germany. People lost confidence in the democratic system and turned towards the extremist political parties, the communists and the Nazis. Hitler also used violence to support his message, so his private army, the stormtroopers, attacked Hitler's political opponents and protested in the streets, getting into street fights with their opponents to try to intimidate those who might speak out against Hitler. Hitler's lieutenants, including Joseph Goebbels, led a very strong propaganda campaign that was effective and won the support of many Germans. The Nazis targeted specific groups of society with different slogans and policies to win their support. Hitler was given power in a seedy political deal by Hindenburg and Papen, who foolishly thought they could control him. The German people were still angry about the Treaty of Versailles and supported Hitler because he promised to overturn it. And finally, many industrialists, the rich people in Germany, gave Hitler lots of money and support because they believed his message would be the most beneficial to them. Now, in addition to Germany, fascist dictatorships had sprung up in other European countries as well. Benito Mussolini, for instance, became the Prime Minister of Italy in 1922 when in a bloodless coup known as the March on Rome, he took power. On the other hand, in Spain, Francisco Franco became the dictator of that country by winning the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. Now, our second reason why World War II happened is the policy of appeasement. Now, appeasement means to negotiate and give in to the demands of someone else in order to make them happy, in the hopes that this will avoid further conflict. So the idea of appeasement is that you're going to give in a little bit now, and hopefully that will make the other side happy, so they'll stop demanding things. In the case of Germany in the 1930s, countries such as Great Britain, France, and Canada believed that appeasing Hitler was the best strategy to avoid another major war. Remember, at this time, these countries are less than 20 years removed from the Great War, from World War I, where millions of people were killed. And remember, World War I, in the minds of the leaders at the time, was the war to end all wars. They didn't want a repeat of that war, so they wanted to do everything they could to avoid another conflict. And if that meant giving in a little bit to Hitler, that's what these countries wanted to do. Their hope was they could give in to some of his demands in the hopes that he would stop demanding things, and this would avoid a conflict. However, appeasement was not a great strategy. Hitler did not stop asking for new things. He kept demanding more. So here are some examples of appeasement. In March of 1936, the German military remilitarized the Rhineland, which is the area on the border of Belgium and France. Now, this was specifically forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. You might remember in World War I, Germany invaded Belgium and France. So the French and the Belgians, they wanted to prevent this from happening again. The idea of the Treaty of Versailles was that they couldn't send their military into this area. There would be sort of a buffer zone between the two countries. Here's Hitler going in direct opposition to that by putting his military back in the Rhineland. Fast forward 2 years. In March 1938, we have the Anschluss, which is the annexation of Austria. To annex a country means to essentially take it in as part of your own, to make it part of your country. So this is Germany making Austria part of Germany. Now, this was also specifically forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles specifically said Germany could not do this, and Hitler is going against that. Nothing's being done, though. In September 1938, we have the Munich Agreement. So Hitler was demanding that a part of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland, be made part of Germany. This was a part of Czechoslovakia where there were many German speakers, and Hitler argued that they would be discriminated against, and that they needed to be made part of the German Empire to have their rights protected. So the idea was, in the Munich Agreement, Britain and France agreed to give Hitler this part of Czechoslovakia in the hopes that he would stop demanding more territory. However, only a few months later, in March of 1939, Germany invaded and annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia. And here's a very famous picture. So this man here in the center of the photograph holding up a piece of paper is the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. Now, he is holding up a piece of paper, and in this speech, he says, to paraphrase him, that this is the piece of paper which has avoided another major world war. The irony being that this agreement, in many ways, is what helped lead to the Second World War. Our third major cause of World War II was the failure of the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was created at the end of World War I in an attempt to prevent future conflicts. Like the United Nations today, the League of Nations was meant to be a place where countries could meet regularly to solve international problems peacefully. Now, despite its lofty promises, the League was not successful at doing this. And there are a few reasons why it wasn't successful. First of all, the United States was an emerging world power at this time. And in fact, the US President, Woodrow Wilson, was the person who put forth this idea at the end of World War I, that they create the League of Nations. The US, though, does not join the League of Nations. The US Senate will not approve letting the US join. So despite being a powerful emerging country, and being the country that proposed this idea, the US is not a member of this. Second, the League had no way to enforce international laws or punish countries that broke them, except through economic sanctions or limiting international trade. Now, this can work in certain circumstances by preventing trade between countries, but it can really only go so far. And if a country keeps breaking the rules, at some point there needs to be other consequences for that if they're not respecting those sanctions. And lastly, despite having sanctions put on them for a variety of violations of international law, countries such as Germany, Japan, and Italy largely ignored the League of Nations and continued to invade other countries. To just give you an example of this, in the 1930s, Japan was aggressively trying to expand its empire in the Pacific, and they had invaded part of mainland China, known as Manchuria. And the League of Nations was not happy about this, so they called an emergency session to try to deal with this situation, to try to deal with Japan's aggressiveness, and they told Japan, you have to leave Manchuria. The Japanese delegation responded by getting up and leaving the meeting. They essentially quit the League of Nations, said, we don't care, we're not listening to you. So the League of Nations lacked the teeth to maintain international security. They couldn't stop the dog of war. And our final major cause of the Second World War is the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was particularly hard on Germany. Britain and France wanted to make Germany pay for the damages caused by the First World War. So their solution to this was to have Germany pay 132 billion marks, about the equivalent of $33 billion in reparations. And they also made Germany accept guilt for the war, the War Guilt Clause. Now, the terms of the treaty led to many economic problems in Germany, such as hyperinflation. So to pay for the war, Germany borrowed large sums of money from countries such as the United States. And as a result, they had a huge debt. And to pay off the debt, they began printing more and more money. The problem was that the government was printing too much money. Businesses were not expanding to make real economic growth. The government was just printing more money, literally turning on the printing presses and printing more to pay off their debts. And when a country does this, it devalues their currency. So because there's more money and the economy hasn't grown at all, essentially the buying power of a unit of money becomes less. So here's what that looked like in reality. In 1922, $1 US was the equivalent of about 300 marks. In 1933, $1 US was the equivalent of 50,000 marks. So we see the skyrocketing number of marks it takes to buy a single US dollar. And at a certain point, this became out of control. In the 1920s, there were points where it cost millions of marks to buy simple items like a loaf of bread. Paper money was worthless, and it was being devalued at such a rate. There are many famous stories of Germans using their paper money as wallpaper or burning their money for heat because their money had been devalued to the point where it costs less money to burn the money than it would to buy energy. So this was a severe problem for Germany. It ruined their economy. Now, Hitler was able to use this to his advantage. He was able to use the anger that Germans felt about the Treaty of Versailles in order to gain support. He also blamed groups within Germany, such as the Jewish people, for putting Germany in this position. This is the famous stabbed in the back myth. And this is the conspiracy theory that was around in right-wing circles at the time, so that lots of Nazis would have believed, that Germany didn't really lose World War I. They believed that groups like the Jews stabbed them in the back. Now, many Germans felt, they were prone to believing this conspiracy theory. If you remember back to World War I, the vast majority of the war was not fought in Germany. In fact, Germany only had the war come into their territory in the final few months of the war. Most of the war was being fought in France and Belgium. So many Germans, when the war was over, felt like maybe they didn't really lose this war. Maybe it was elements of the German government or people in Germany who had turned their back to Germany. So we see the scapegoating of minority groups, such as the Jews, the idea that they stabbed them in the back. And this helps gain lots of support for Hitler. He's blaming groups and scapegoating them for things that they didn't really do. And so in summary, there were many causes of World War II, but four of the most significant included the rise of Hitler, appeasement, the failure of the League of Nations, and the Treaty of Versailles. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and his aggressive foreign policy led him to invade other countries. The policy of appeasement was meant to prevent another war, but only emboldened Hitler. The League of Nations failed in its aim to peacefully resolve disputes between countries, and the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms on Germany that hurt their economy and made many Germans angry.